It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. This is the first lecture of this new season. Last time we met was in November 2023. I was on sabbatical for a few months, so it's really great to be back in the space and to introduce our speaker this evening, Astra Taylor, and the subject of her talk. Polarization, social inequality, the rise of autocrats, a backlash against immigrants and refugees, a global pandemic, humanitarian crises, war. Many citizens around the world struggle to overcome feelings of anger, mistrust, and insecurity in the face of these challenges and threats that we face every day. Yet previous generations have faced equal, if not greater, tasks at critical turning points in their history, from popular struggles to end slavery and grant equal rights and universal suffrage, to anti-colonial and nationalist movements demanding political liberation and the end to imperial rule. Key to many of these struggles, and to the idea of democracy itself, were the twin values of freedom and equality. Yet they also depended on a third revolutionary ideal that has generally received less attention: solidarity. What is solidarity? How does it relate to fraternity, sisterhood, or unity, if at all? What strategies can we use to allow solidarity to rise and expand? Can we come together to address the crises that we face today? And what happens given the accelerating risk of climate calamity if we cannot? Our guest this evening has thought hard about these questions, literally on the front lines of struggles in the United States and beyond. A critically acclaimed writer, filmmaker, and organizer, Astra Taylor is a co-founder of a union of debtors called the Debt Collective. Over her career, she has produced numerous documentaries, including Zizek, Examine Life, and What is Democracy? A prolific author, she also contributes frequently to major publications such as Dissent, The New Yorker, The Baffler, The New York Times and London Review Books, and N1+1, to name just a few. Her books range across a vast canvas, from the history of democracy and the relevance of philosophy to everyday life, to the transformation of the public sphere in the digital age, and the rise of insecurity, the subject of her CBC Massey Lectures in 2023. Her most recent book, co-authored with Leah Hunt Hendricks, is Solidarity, the past, present, and future of a world-changing idea. Astra is going to speak for about half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with her to explore some of the issues and themes raised by her lecture and in her book, and then we're really happy to open up the floor to your comments and questions. Please join me in welcoming Astra Taylor.
Thank you so much. That was such an incredibly kind introduction. Thank you, Sanjay, for having me. Thanks all of you for coming. Thank you, Sergio, for opening this space. I love public libraries so much. So this is sort of my favorite kind of venue. The introduction started to get at this a bit, but why solidarity? You know, this is a word that seems pretty self-evident. It's a word that's used a lot if you travel in certain circles, activist circles like I do, right? I get emails at least once a week signed off in solidarity. It's a word that, again, can seem self-evident, but I think it's really worth lingering on it and thinking more deeply about it. If you scan the shelves of a library like this or a bookstore, the thing is, you won't actually find a lot of books on this topic. You might find some books on the solidarity movement in Poland or solidarity movements with Latin America, but a surprising lack of sort of popular topics or more systematic analyses of it, especially when you contrast it to things like freedom, equality, democracy. There are tons of books about those themes. In fact, I wrote one about democracy. And this is a problem because solidarity, I've come to believe, is as essential to democracy as its cousins, as freedom and equality. It's actually really foundational. I suppose if there's one thing I want to leave you with today, it's that solidarity is actually a precursor to democracy, that we actually cannot have democracy. We'll never be able to finally build a functional multiracial democracy without solidarity. So we really do need to think about it. So why? Why is solidarity so central to democracy? I mean, I think to put it really simply, solidarity is a relational concept, right? It's something between us. It refers to this sort of feeling between people, a social bond, and democracy is relational. Democracy is people doing stuff together. And it strikes me as a kind of indictment of Western political thought that we actually have to remind ourselves of this. And there are indigenous political traditions that actually put relations at the center, being in right relation, that are sort of actually all centered around relationships, not just with other individuals, but other groups, relationships with the natural world, with the earth, air, and water that we that we depend on. And so, it's striking, this lack of attention to solidarity, to relationships is really striking to me, and I think we need to put this concept back in the canon, back in that pantheon. So the fact that there weren't many books on the library shelf gave my co-author and I kind of permission to devise our own theory of solidarity. And I just want to summarize some of our thoughts, some of our theory here. And the first thing we did was sort of try to clarify what kind of solidarity we're talking about. Because solidarity, again, is just the bonds between us. It can be neutral, it can be good, but it can also be negative. And so we wanted to distinguish the types of solidarity we're talking about. And this is something the few people who have written about solidarity have done this before. It goes all the way back to the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who wrote sort of the first big books on solidarity. And he distinguished between mechanical and organic solidarity. People more recently have differentiated between factual and normative solidarity. I honestly cannot remember what that distinction was. It went over my head. More typically, people will talk about civic, social, and political solidarity. There's a great essay that distinguishes between mundane and sublime solidarity. But what we decided to do is distinguish between transformative solidarity and reactionary solidarity. So transformative solidarity is the kind of solidarity that connects people across difference and aims at social change. It's the force that achieved universal suffrage, the 8-hour workday, the weekend, the abolition of slavery. It made the modern welfare state viable, defeated Jim Crow. It is that fighting spirit that we know so well. Transformative solidarity, in the sense, is both personal and political. So it shifts both your sense of yourself, but also your sense of the wider world, and ultimately aims to change that wider world. In contrast, reactionary solidarity turns inward, it affirms sameness, it shrinks the circle of inclusion, whereas transformative solidarity expands it. So, think of the reactionary solidarity of ethno-nationalists, white supremacists, misogynists, and so on. And we think this distinction is so important that we actually open the book with a tale of reactionary solidarity. We tell the story of the Southern strategy. Is this familiar to people? So the Southern strategy was articulated by a guy in his late 20s who wrote a book called The Emerging Republican Majority that was published in 1969. So following on the civil rights movement, the organizing of the 1960s, and he dedicates the book to Richard Nixon. He's a political operative, conservative guy. And he basically says, the key to winning back the South for Republicans is stoking racial enmity, right? And this was a guy who was just revered by the Republican political class. And he told an interviewer that he was in charge of his own new field. And that field was knowing the secret of politics, which was knowing who hates who. And this book is big. It's like a tome that looks at the data and sort of sets out this strategy for dividing people, stoking hate, and winning elections. Kevin Phillips did not, of course, invent the politics of divide and conquer, but he professionalized it and really brought it into the heart of the American political system. And over half a century since he made those observations, our society remains riven by many of the same sectional conflicts and these group animosities. And a powerful, and I would argue bipartisan elite, still seeks to inflame them and profit from them financially and politically. And Sanjay got into some of this in the introduction, right? We're in a moment of increasing ecological instability, political upheaval, and tumult, and there are forces that are taking advantage of this and bringing Philip's strategies to bear. There's a far right around the world that is, stoking division very relentlessly, and they have a tremendous amount of money to do this, and they're investing incredible energy towards suppressing solidarity and attacking the institutions that incubate it. There's a long history of attacking labor unions. Increasingly, we're seeing attacks on institutions of higher education. Libraries in the United States are under attack. And one of my points here is just that dividing people is a demanding enterprise. It actually takes a lot of work. So just like cultivating transformative solidarity takes work, so does cultivating reactionary solidarity. And this work is very conscious. In the book, we reference an op-ed written by none other than Donald Trump, exactly 30 years after Phillips published his book. So it was 1999, and it was published in the Los Angeles Times. And Donald Trump is blasting this guy, Patrick Buchanan, who is running for president at the time on the Republican ticket. And Trump says, on slow days, he attacks gays, immigrants, welfare recipients, even Zulus. Buchanan is rewriting history and spreading fear for one purpose, to gain political power. And of course, this isn't just happening in the United States. This is a global strategy. We see it in Narendra Modi's Hindutva dogma that promotes Hindu Brahminical domination through violence against Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and Dalits. We see this in Viktor Orban in Hungary, who promotes a kind of fascist traditionalism. We see this in Benjamin Netanyahu's Zionism that colonizes and kills Palestinians while smearing anti-Zionist Jews in Israel and beyond. We see this in the legacy of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is promoting a kind of Christian majority at the expense of other social groups. And these leaders, have each other's backs. And one of the ironies of this kind of ethno-nationalist formation is that they're internationalists. So reactionary solidarity is, a consciously international project. And again, these people are using this division because it serves a purpose. To paraphrase the legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez, reactionary solidarity functions as a plutocrat's scythe, right? So a way to cut down social solidarity in order to harvest wealth and power. And harvest they are, right? These fascist formations are sadly gaining steam around the world. But the problem is not just the far right. Those who claim to represent the political center distinguish themselves by not being as extreme as their right-wing opponents, but they too are wary of solidarity, and they foster division in more subtle and seemingly responsible ways. So if conservatives recklessly wield a scythe, demonizing different groups with sinister and destabilizing abandon, their liberal counterparts too often prefer to use garden shears, sort of trimming solidarity back to seemingly manageable and certainly not transformative proportions. And liberals tend to do this by, for example, ranking and sorting people, using means-tested programs to distinguish worthy recipients from unworthy recipients, the deserving poor from the undeserving poor, right? Those with merit in contrast to those who don't have merit. And these classifications ultimately impede solidarity by making it appear as though these differentials of wealth, of opportunity are fair. So garden shears might appear more prudent and responsible, but both those shears and the scythe have similarly destructive impacts on our social landscape. The constant pruning of solidarity's fragile shoots has allowed inequality to take deeper root. Our sense of ourselves has been diminished and reshaped, the illusion perpetuated that division is a feature of human nature and that we are consigned to this zero-sum struggle for resources. So I don't think that I would have appreciated solidarity as something to really think about in a deep way if I wasn't working as an organizer by working I mean volunteering, but it is work, focused on the issue of inequality. And so, as was mentioned, I'm the founder of, or a co-founder of a group called the Debt Collective, which is an experimental union of debtors. We take inspiration from the labor movement, and the idea is that people who are in debt, if they come together, could potentially exercise a kind of economic and political power. And the goal is not just to win debt cancellation, but to change the way goods and services are provided. In the US, people are indebted for basic medical care. Here people are as well, for things like dental care and medicines and more. Canada is not perfect, but obviously in the US, it's much more dire. And our point is that it's a sort of, it's easy to make the connection between the medical bill that you can't pay or that you put on your credit card to the need for universal health care. It's easy to connect your student loans to the need for fully funded public education. And so our group has, in the last 10 years, made pretty tremendous inroads on student debt relief and medical debt, and sort of made these major issues in the American political arena. I was just at the Democratic National Convention, sort of improbably, with the first ever member of the Debt Collective who led a student debt strike, gave a speech on the stage 3 hours before Kamala Harris. We could talk more about that. It was a conflicted moment, actually, for me. But, the idea that debtors had something in common was hardly intuitive 10 years ago, let alone that, student debtors would have something in common with medical debtors, would have something in common with people who, for example, have credit card debt. The solidarity was something that we had to really consciously build by reaching out to people, by inviting them into the movement. And so for the last few months, we have been working very hard on actually growing our older debtors caucus, because in the United States, the fastest growing group of student borrowers in the country are people over 60, because there's no old age security, really. People lose their jobs and are told to go back to school. And so older folks are buried in debt they'll never pay, and if they default, their Social Security is garnished, their tax returns are garnished, their wages are garnished. The consequences are absolutely dire. Sorry, this is a bit of a long-winded story, but we found out that there's actually a little-known provision that enables the Department of Education to cancel a debtor's student loans based on their age. So all of these old folks could have their debts canceled tomorrow with a signature from the Secretary of Education. So we have been inviting older people into this movement, trying to build that solidarity. So we had a big protest last week where it was the first time older debtors had ever taken action in Washington, D.C. And I just want to read a quote from one of the women who attended this. So we brought something like 60 debtors over the age of 50. Some of them were in their 70s, some were in their 80s. And one of them was Gail Gardner. She's a black woman. She's a reverend. She lives in Georgia. She is 77 years old, and she owes $549,497.20 in student debt. And so she had never admitted this to anyone before. She finally comes out, we bring her to DC, and this is what she wrote afterwards. I can't begin to tell you how I am trying my best to process what happened, but it was so fantastic and so fresh and so new in my life that I can't express it all. I went to Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, and I got an award. But that was nothing like being with the Debt Collective and those who came to join in solidarity. And I quote this because that's the work of building solidarity, is person by person, bringing folks into something, changing how they understand themselves, changing how they understand their power, and helping them visualize a very different world. And I met my co-author, Leah Hunt-Hendricks, through this work. We met at Occupy Wall Street, which is where the seeds of the Debt Collective were planted. So that was back in 2011. And she comes from a very different background than me. She is an oil heiress, to put it bluntly. And her grandfather was a very far-right guy, kind of like the tech billionaires of today. So he used his fortune to fund the Birch Society and other far-right causes. Fortunately, his daughters rebelled. And so Leah's mother and her aunt really bristled especially at his incredible sexism and began funding the women's movement in the 1970s. And Leah has been focused on issues of economic inequality. So she actually organizes other wealthy people to support radical movements. So she organizes donors and I organize debtors. So people with excess wealth, people with negative wealth. And so one day in 2019, Leah called me and she said, there's something she'd been meaning to tell me. She thought I would really be interested. I was like, what? And she said, you know, you love etymology. I need to tell you that the origin of the word solidarity is actually from ancient Roman law, and it means a debt held in common, obligatio in solidum. And she was right. I was like, wow, that's really cool, because we're both nerds, and this is part of how we bonded. And just, you know, she knew that as someone who organizes around debt, I would really be excited by this. But part of what was neat about it is that it immediately showed that, you know, solidarity is not just a fuzzy affect or a feeling; it's material. It's actually being on the hook for each other. And so over the course of researching and writing this book together, the concept's evolution came more clearly into focus. Unlike principles such as justice and liberty, solidarity did not become a popular political ideal until the mid-19th century. But it came into political discourse as a kind of metaphor from this ancient legal concept. So this idea of obligatio in solidum was picked up from ancient Roman law. It was incorporated into 17th and 18th century French texts. It became kind of established in Napoleon's civil code in 1804. But then again, something about this idea captured people's political imaginations. And during the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution and the sort of democratic rebellions of that era, solidarity started to seem like a really important concept. As kings were deposed and the church's role as a locus of moral authority waned, philosophers and citizens wondered how the hell society was going to stick together. There's all this transformation. What's going to hold us? You know, no God, like things are going to collapse. And people thought, well, hold on, maybe solidarity will save us. And this idea became popular in a way that's almost hard to imagine. We quote some old newspapers that are literally like, everywhere you go, people are talking about solidarity. This concept's on everybody's lips. People are mad for it. It became something that people were really thinking about. Workers, socialists, and a solidarist political movement in France adopted the concept. Solidarity became a rallying cry for the exploited and also a way for more privileged reformers to think about how to solve the problems created by unfettered capitalism. And I just want to draw these two ways of thinking about solidarity out. So there were, as I mentioned, these solidarists. This was a movement that organized around the concept of solidarity. It was made up of sociologists and philosophers and statesmen, and the most famous adherent of this school of thought was Emile Durkheim, the godfather of sociology. And these people really settled on the idea of solidarity as that which would hold society together during this period of flux. And they played an important role in actually creating the basis of the French welfare state. And so their view of solidarity really emphasizes social cohesion, again, that bonding, right, that bonding process. At the same time, the labor movement is gaining steam, right? This is the Industrial Revolution. Workers are getting organized. They're beginning to form labor unions. They're getting class conscious. They're seeing the way that the owning class is getting rich off their labor. And solidarity becomes a meaningful concept for them. So you have sort of two concepts of solidarity: cohesion, social cohesion, and also change. So a bond, but also this force that propels society forward. And if you talk to sociologists, they'll kind of assume you have to pick one or the other. Like, it's not very popular to be interested both in Durkheim and Marx, right? You're supposed to pick. But one of the benefits of not being an academic is I'm like, we need both. They both have something, and I have that right. And I think these, for me as an organizer, it makes a lot of sense because you actually need people to feel connected, to have each other's backs in order for them to fight for each other. And I think I'm someone more steeped in sort of the fighting tradition, the Marxist tradition, but I think there's actually a lot to learn from the solidarists and their way of approaching solidarity. So just, I want to say a bit about them because for me they were more of a novel. This history is a bit more novel. So these were upper class guys, and they were making the case to their fellow elites that solidarity would benefit them. The main person was actually, he was literally named Leon Bourgeois. That was his name. He was the son of a clockmaker, and he actually rose to become the Prime Minister of France during the Third Republic, before he went on to help form the League of Nations. And he wrote the first pamphlet on solidarity, and it's actually really beautiful and in some ways quite prescient. So in Bourgeois' formulation, solidarity is actually an ethos of mutual entanglement. It's a way of understanding our connections to other people. And he offers some really interesting insights that we can use. So, for example, he talks about social debt and how we're all born debtors to humanity because none of us create the world that we're born into. Right? We walk on roads we didn't pave. We speak languages we didn't invent. I drink coffee that I didn't learn how to brew. I didn't invent how to brew. We're all born debtors, and for him, we pay this social debt forward by leaving the world a better place for future generations. So in this, he's very clear that we need care throughout our lives. He kind of anticipates discourse around care. He's got a kind of nascent sort of environmental consciousness of, well, we breathe air that should be clean, and we're all interconnected. And he also talks about reparative justice, that we actually have a collective responsibility to fix past wrongs. And one way we can do this and also pay our social debts, he says, is to pay our taxes. And so he became a big advocate for progressive taxation. And that was actually sort of part of why he was pushed out of power at one point. He went on and he tried to take his ideas to the international stage. And he ended up giving a lecture in 1909 to the National French Peace Congress. And he argued that there needed to be a society of nations that could establish among themselves equal rights and reciprocal duties so that each nation could flourish and be free. So in other words, take this idea of solidarity, the doctrine of solidarism, to the international realm. And in that same address, Bourgeois presciently warned that conflicts in Europe could no longer be localized. So he's saying we can't actually retreat to the national stage anymore. He said that because of the increasing number of treaties and alliances, that a fire kindled, these are his words, a fire kindled at any one point on the continent would be in danger of ending in a general conflagration that would compromise the whole of civilization. And of course, a few years later, with the advent of World War I, his fears came to pass. And when the war ended, questions of reparative justice really came to the fore, right? Who's responsible? Who should pay? Who should be cared for? Who should be first in line as Europe tried to rebuild? And in their attempt to find answers, French legal thinkers and politicians drew on the solidarist notion of social debt. It was clear to some that Europe as a whole owed a debt to the victims of the catastrophic war, especially civilians who had their livelihoods and property destroyed. And people thought, understandably, that Germany, having propelled this conflict, needed to pay reparations. And so a big debate about reparations came to the fore. I'm sure people know about the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that Germany was weighted down by debts. And what the solidarists did, their intervention was to try to encourage the international community to think about reparations in a different way. Not as revenge, but as world-making, right? As repairing and creating a new community. But that required solidarity, which was in short supply. So on paper, the treaty clearly distinguished reparations from indemnities, or a fine exacted by a victor. But in practice, the line blurred. So the solidarists wanted reparations to be a responsibility to be shared, but there were lots of people who were happy with the idea of revenge. And the German far right saw the imposition of punishment that they wanted to avoid. So one of the people who was actually most public and most vocal in pushing against the treaty and this vengeful idea of reparations, in addition to John Maynard Keynes, who, as many people know, wrote at length about the fact that Germany actually needed some kind of debt cancellation. The other person who joined his chorus was the anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who was Durkheim's nephew. And he became a leading voice on this issue. And Mauss was initially supportive of the treaty, but he grew increasingly worried about it. He said, reparations are right and they're required, but the bulk of the cost should be borne by the rich, not the poor. And they should be structured that way to avoid economic desperation and to dampen anti-Semitic ethno-nationalist currents looking for a scapegoat. And so he wrote again and again in the popular press, arguing for a delay that would allow the economy to rebuild, or debt cancellation or partial debt cancellation. And that didn't come to pass, in part because the United States refused to cancel France's debt, which put pressure on France to collect on the German debt. No country would budge. And so the national reaction that most feared grew. And some of you might be familiar with Mauss's book, The Gift, right? And this was new to me, but reading that book as a kind of parable of that experience, Mauss was concerned with the question of what holds society together and what can break it apart. And so his book, The Gift, can be read as an allegorical commentary on the question of reparations. What he said in the book was that there was this challenge with initiating a cycle of solidaristic gift exchange, and it sort of anticipated what soon happened in the wider world. No nation, these are his words, no nation wanted to be the first to give, as they thought the gift would be a sign of weakness, not of strength. And so as a result, the debt was imposed on Germany, but in a way, in exactly the way that he feared, so in a way that benefited industrialists in both Germany and France. There was a kind of cross-border deal reached. So German industrialists agreed to give the French 18% of the coal produced in exchange for the abolition of pro-labor laws passed by the Weimar Republic. And so instead of healing the scars left by the war, wounds deepened and festered. And so I think this is also sort of part of why the school of thought isn't really remembered today. It was also buried in the wreckage of World War I. They lost the argument, and then the world moved on. But I think there's something here, this idea of true reparations, reparative justice, this solidarist notion of thinking, again, that emphasis on transformation, about thinking about how we build new communities. And that we do so precisely so that we can avoid catastrophe, avoid, in their case, the horrible catastrophe of Hitler's rise in World War II. So I think you see in that story that solidarity is essential to peace. But as I've said, solidarity also entails conflict. So there's kind of a tension there. Solidarity is not the same thing as unity. It's not the idea that we should all just get along. So this really is one of the greatest tensions, I think, in this concept. To build a more inclusive world, we have to be clear about who we are not, what we're up against, what we want to change. Solidarity does involve an us and a them. Workers unite against bosses, right? Feminists fight back against misogynists and patriarchal structures. Movements for racial justice protest individuals and systems that perpetuate bigotry. Solidarity, to use the argot of political scientists, is polarizing. It names an opponent as it constructs a community. And hopefully this polarization is generative, not destructive. But I think we have to admit that it's risky. In the words of foreign policy expert Stephen Wertheim, in fighting the other, we remake ourselves. He was talking about war making, but I think the same holds true for social movements. We have to be careful about how we define us and them so that conflict doesn't spiral into catastrophe. Here we could look to a distinction made by the political theorist Chantal Mouffe. She distinguishes between what she calls agonistic conflict and antagonistic conflict, between agonism and antagonism. Agonistic conflict identifies them as a legitimate adversary to be engaged, one to be either contained or transformed, whereas antagonistic conflict identifies them as an enemy to be annihilated. And so in this naming of an us and a them, in this polarization, our position is it's better to stay away from that latter antagonistic path. The last thing I want to say before I wrap is just that, solidarity, another big thing for us is that solidarity is not selfless. It really is based in the recognition that one's own liberation and thriving is intimately bound with the liberation and thriving of others. I think that's another lesson of the story of Mos in World War I. That's why the solidarist emphasis on difference, mutual obligation, social debt, and interdependence strikes me as so key. And so we recount in the book, various tales of solidarity movements, but also of examples of people acting in solidarity with folks who are very different from them, right? So class traders like Leah, who I wrote the book with, or like Ingalls, who came from an industrial family and used his wealth to support Karl Marx. We can think now about all of the folks in the US, the doctors and healthcare providers who are risking their job security and actually risking jail time to help people get the reproductive health care and gender-affirming health care that they need right now, right? We can think about the people from all walks of life who have been protesting for a permanent end to the war in Gaza, even though they live thousands of miles away. This kind of solidarity cannot be reduced to pity, charity, or philanthropy, which we call semblances of solidarity. They're nice, but they're one-sided, they're asymmetrical. Instead, solidarity is based on the awareness that none of us are free until all of us are free, and that siding with others against those who seek to divide and conquer to maintain their own power and dominance is the only way to rescue ourselves from the catastrophes that will otherwise engulf us. And this work, the reason I told the story of the Debt Collective is this work is really tough, actually. Building bridges and bonds of solidarity requires patience. It's much easier to draw lines and pass judgments and condemn people. But the reality is that none of us are perfectly pure and enlightened. We're all implicated to varying degrees in the systems that we're fighting against. And that's why I think the emphasis on transformation is so important. Transformative solidarity means not writing anyone off completely, not throwing anyone away, and holding out hope, even if you seem naive, that individuals and systems can change. And through that work, hopefully changing yourself. So thank you.
So as you could tell from that talk, this is an incredibly rich book. It's packed with ideas and thoughts and reflections, and it's actually really challenging to know how to start a conversation, but I'm going to try. And I think maybe one, so start with the idea, the concept, and then think about some applications and some examples we could kind of work through. So one of the things I think is interesting in your discussion just now and in the book is solidarity is an elusive concept. All concepts that are important are contested in various ways. What is freedom? What's equality? What's justice? Solidarity has an elusiveness about it, or at least a number of dimensions. And let me just try to focus on one for a second. So crucial to the idea of solidarity is that we're interdependent. We need each other to live, survive, right, as species. Right now and across generations in particular. So that's the idea of intergenerational, what we owe each other across generations. And today we very much hear it and feel it when we think about climate justice, right? We have to, it's very much essential to indigenous thought and environmental movement. We have to leave the world in a state that it's sustainable for the next generation. But, and that I can see how it relates to the idea of debt we hold in common. But debt we hold in common might also mean something quite different. I was sort of thinking of the work of a book some of you may know by the late David Graeber on debt. And he says, debt's a really strange way of thinking about human relations, right? Because it's sort of an economistic way. It's about money. And in fact, in his book, he says it's also just about violence. Right? The history of debt is about the history of violence, and it's in cash, literally money. And he says, there's certain, I'll put it as a question, there's certain debts, as you were saying, that we hold in common, and we should. There are obligations we hold to each other and across generations, but there are others that are really pernicious. Yeah. So he gives the example of the 1970s. I mean, in the beginning of the neoliberal era, right? You had the oil boom in the Middle East, you had all this money flowing, and you had all these what they call petrodollars. Banks in the US said, well, you know, where's the money going to go? It comes to U.S. banks, and then they go off to all these other client states in many parts of the world, and they say, you need this money, we're going to give you loans. And often the governments they're giving them to were dictatorships or autocrats of various kinds. And by the 1980s, because of a series of economic changes, rise in interest rates and so on, you have these debt crises. And we're facing debt crises again today. We can get to that later in the discussion, right? So what I'm trying to get to is, in that case, even though you had changes in government, even though you had changes in regime, you had the toppling of dictators, the rising of new democratic governments, the international financial system said, you know, you, country X, Ecuador, Bolivia, whichever country it might be, owe us this debt. The debt was taken by your previous government, but because you are a sovereign country, the debt is now yours. So I'm just giving that as an example to get at this issue of when we think about debts we hold in common today across generations, how do you think about distinguishing the debts that we should hold in common and that normatively or ethically are ones we would endorse, right? Like we affirm those debts and they're our responsibility, versus debts that are pernicious and iniquitous that a subsequent generation shouldn't have to take on?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the book actually talks a lot about sovereign debt and the way that some of these sovereign debts you're talking about were actually imposed on countries after decolonization as a form of neocolonialism, right? So so there's a political interest in these debts, and you know, many countries are paying more to their foreign creditors than they're able to pay in public provision. You know, countries are paying more in interest rates.
Payments,
and there were many leaders who recognized this and actually, you know, articulated the odious character of these debts. So absolutely. I mean, the one mantra of the Debt Collective is that we need to strike and refuse our unjust debts so we can pay our just debts, right? And so that means nobody should have to pay their student loans because we should be entitled to education. No one should have to pay debts for health care because we are entitled to health care. Nobody should have to pay debts to a racist criminal justice system, right? I mean, people in the United States can't vote because they owe debts for their electronic monitoring device. And in a way, the fact that we have to pay these debts is part of why we're defaulting on our real debts, right? Climate debt, reparations, our sort of broader social debt, and that we could pay to provide for each other. So I think we need a kind of moral accounting, right? What debts are just, what debts are unjust. The David question, though, is interesting because David was a dear friend of mine and actually helped found the precursor to the Debt Collective. So David is actually why I went to Occupy Wall Street. He was trying to get me to go to the planning meetings, and I didn't think that we'd be able to occupy Wall Street, and so I put him off, and I went to the first day instead, just to be a good friend. And David roped me into these working groups that then eventually became the Debt Collective. He went to London for a job, and one of the first people I called, so I started writing this book seriously during COVID, and one of the first people I wanted to talk about it, I wanted to discuss the idea with, was David. And I texted him, and we actually had a call on the books for a week after he died. And I wanted to debate him, because I think David would actually really disagree with part of our argument, because David, as an anarchist, and just as a freedom lover, really dislike the idea that there's a kind of primordial debt, that we're born indebted, which is something Leah and I really lean on, that actually we are. We are indebted on some level. There's not a number to it. It's not, you can't really say, oh, I owe my parents X amount of money and I owe my community X amount of money because they birthed me and nurtured me and stuff, but there's this sense of obligation. But this idea of that kind of being born into debt is something he bristles against at various points in that great book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So there was a conversation I never got to have there that would have been part of our long friendship, but also long debate.
So you have to have a moral accounting almost prior to this, right? Because there's a very powerful statement in the book. I'm just looking up here again, is that, you know, we are all morally in the red. And when you write that in the book, it's particularly for those of us who live in the West, because of the history of slavery and colonization and imperialism and the impact industrialization in the West has had on many other parts of the world. So that's the sort of, that's a very deep moral intuition for you.
Yeah, and that's Martin Luther King who says that, actually. He paints a portrait of somebody waking up, and he says, you know, you wake up and you wash your hands with soap from France, and you dry your face with a towel from Turkey, and you drink coffee from Ethiopia, and, you know, by the time it's like 9 a.m., you're indebted to half the world, you know? And I think and to me, that moral intuition really does resonate. But David said, you know, debt is a promise corrupted by math and money or something. Yes. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah. And I think there is a violence to debt. That's why the debt collective exists. But that doesn't mean that the concept doesn't also have this, this moral register.
So you articulated, I mean, I'm very sympathetic. Maybe lots of people here are too. A very sort of, I mean, classic socialist vision, right?
Yeah.
Like, why should students have to pay their debts for tuition they take, right, for instance, and so on. So let me pretend I'm a conservative for a moment, right? And some of you may feel like this here too. So there's a conservative argument against that, which is to say, well, whatever happens then, so you talk about collective responsibility. We do have collective responsibility for all kinds of things, but we also have personal responsibility. So when you take out a loan, you know that there's some risk involved, and so there's a personal responsibility that you in a sense, you own that as well. So how do you relate to that? Because you gave a lot of examples about what of debts we shouldn't have. And I agree, some of them are absolutely pernicious and odious, right? So people who go into serious indebtedness and poverty because they can't afford health care. So that's why we think that's a really important one. But I can imagine someone saying, okay, if you and I go to university, and the US might be the extreme case because it's so prohibitive, but if you and I go to university, not everyone goes to university, right? In our societies, there's a percentage of people that do. Why should society, I mean, I can see even an economic argument for why we want to invest in people who may have certain skills and so on and so forth, but let's put that aside for a second. Just as morally, why should society as a whole take on that burden of educating some who decide to do that, but not others?
I mean, at the Debt Collective, I hear this sort of stuff all day, every day, and so there's, you know, I guess the argument, I'd have to know more about who I was engaging with to know exactly how I would parry with that assertion. You know, some people say that because they've paid off their debts, and so they feel there's a kind of unfairness, to which I would reply, well, I actually paid off my debts, but I'm not an asshole. No, I would say, just because you suffered, like, the whole point of progress is that other people don't have to suffer the same way. You know, we want, you know, just because you've had to endure some barbaric cancer treatment doesn't mean, you know, doesn't mean that you're not cheering on scientific progress. I mean, I think, and there are compelling economic arguments. I mean, I think there are some arguments that tap into self-interest, right? That we actually, you know, do benefit from people getting all sorts of useful training, and, you know, this might redound in a beneficial way to you because there will be more people who are going into public, family medicine instead of pursuing specializations. There'll be more rural dentists. For example, in the US, there's a crisis of rural dentistry because people have too much debt to be dentists in those areas. But I think, you know, ultimately, I would want to nudge them towards a bigger social good argument, right? Which is that we live in society. We live in a complex democratic society. It benefits us to be educated, and it can take a while to bring people along on that vision. But I actually think people are a lot more sympathetic to it than we think. So this isn't rebutting your argument, but actually, I was looking at the polls recently, and something like 30 or 40% of Republicans under 50 support free college, right? So this is, it might not be such a radical socialist vision, actually. It might be a lot more mainstream than we think.
So another aspect, when you think about solidarity, it's about, I want to ask in the content of it, right? You're an organizer, you're on the front lines, you're working on these issues all the time. Lots of people in this room might be doing similar things in our own lives. So you've mentioned solidarity is, I mean, it's a set of bonds, feeling mutuality. It's a feeling, It's, it's an ethos, but it's also a feeling, almost embodied, right? That you feel a deep empathy or a deep connectedness to others or to a larger cause. And I'm curious about when you think about that, how should I put it? But sort of, so solidarity grows literally by the circle, right? Expanding. More and more people are encompassed in that. But as you say, it involves polarization of a certain kind because you have an adversary that you're arguing against. And I was just thinking when your work, whether it was when you were in Occupy or the Debt Collective or others, you know, can you walk us through like that transformation? Like how does somebody who is skeptical or oppositional to a stance you take, right, say on debt or Occupy Wall Street, during that movement, what's that process of, because you said it's transformational, you're transforming their self-understanding and their relation, how they think of themselves and how they think of themselves vis-a-vis an issue and the rest of a group. How does that work? That's almost like an alchemy, right? A psychological transformation. Like what is happening, and how thick is that sense of bonding? And the way I'd put it is, you know, a lot of sociologists who study this will say, you know, the thickest bonds we have are our closest ones, our family, our friends, or maybe our local community. And as that circle broadens and expands, the connection is thin, right? It has to be thin, because in a sense, we don't know most people that we might have some relationship to, even in our nations, right? Yeah. Ben Anderson's famous phrase, "We're imagined communities," but we feel a connectedness to them. But as that grows further and further afield, the nature of the bond is different, right? It's thin versus thick. Yeah. And so when your own work or when you've been writing this book, how do you think about that process of bringing people more into a cause? Is it persuasion? It involves confrontation. The book talks a lot about the importance of militancy. You have critical passages on liberalism. So liberalism is important, obviously a bedrock set of principles, but it can lead to just charity and paternalism. Sometimes we have to be militant and really name our adversaries and so on. Like, can you, tell us something about how that, in your work, how have you converted anybody on Wall Street to the Debt Collective?
Actually.
Maybe that's the best way of putting it.
I'm just making a note that, I mean, so my strategic choice is to not always lead with like the hardest cases, right? Like I'm not going for like people who are deep in the far right and trying to pick those off. I think that's actually valuable. But my strategy is more, you know, who's on the sidelines and skeptical, who's not participating maybe because they're ashamed, right? Or they are doubtful that there's any utility to it because they're just so beaten down because there's, you know, it doesn't seem like anything gets better. And I think that's a really fair position, right? To just be like, I'm minding my own business because shit's fucked up. And so you know, as an organizer, you sort of win trust and commitment from those folks by showing up for them and, you know, demonstrating, whether by, you know, giving them credible examples of past social movements or your own movement's accomplishments or helping them be part of something, that, you know, things actually, you can make a difference collectively. And so I've seen that as just an incredibly powerful experience with people over and over, where they've come to experience a taste of their own power. You know, the question of conversion, I do think sometimes it does require those, you know, strong ties, as a sociologist would say. I'm thinking about a young man. We had an action in May that was funded under the banner "Fund Education, Not Genocide" in Washington, D.C. And this young man came from the Midwest. And I was really shocked because we were just walking along, and he must have been maybe 23 or 24, and he said, "I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I think he was 18. And I was like, that's interesting. And he said that he had been raised in a really religious family, conservative family, and that he actually he got very sucked into far-right politics online and was an incel. That was his word, right? So, you know, that in the sort of far right of the manosphere. And so I asked him, you know, how he got out of this, and he said that that somebody who was not a good friend, but close enough to see him getting increasingly radicalized, called him out. That he was in college at the time, and a black student said, I see the way you're going, and I want you to come to this documentary. And it was a documentary about the history of mass incarceration. It's a movie called The 13th. And he literally, it was like one person throwing him a lifeline that gave him that bit of an opening to change. So I do think, that, and it wasn't, I think, you mentioned emotions. I think a lot of politics is emotions. It's more than rational arguments. He got some better arguments, but he did it by feeling that there was some kind of invitation there. You said the word alchemy, which I really like. To me, organizing is a kind of alchemy. It turns shame, stigma, insecurity, vulnerability into strength, right? That you're processing these feelings that can be very heavy, very isolating, very demoralizing together. The last thing I want to say, though, is I think that weak ties shouldn't be underestimated. So there are these strong ties. People near you can move you, but people near you who you have strong ties with also see you in a certain way. So we quote a sociologist, I think her name is Frances Paletta in the book, who talked about the power of outside agitators, right? Which is a word we're always told to fear. Well, why does the right wing put so much energy into demonizing outside agitators? Because they're actually really effective. Because sometimes what outsiders do is they come and they validate, right? They make you feel connected to people who are far away. They make you feel that you have support, that there are lessons that can apply to your place. So outside agitators have been huge for the labor movement. Picture Wobblies during, from the International Workers of the World taking trains around and connecting movements, or you picture, students traveling south for the freedom rides during the civil rights movement. Yeah. And these weak ties were actually hugely emboldening and galvanizing for folks. So I always think that's an important thing to remember, that sometimes actually that distance, that not knowing someone can actually help them transform. Yeah. You're not putting on, one thing she says, that people who are known in their community felt they had to be the person they were, the mother, the sister, the brother, the worker, instead of having this moment where they were seen by someone else who saw them as a potential hero, right? Somebody standing up for their community, someone fighting injustice.
Yeah, and a word you just said really struck home, which was validate. Right? And we just think about the struggles we read about in the United States and Canada, Western Europe, many parts of the world, particularly on the left. When people say, whatever happened to parties on the left, they abandoned the working class. And they're real knotty issues, they're complex issues, right? Because there's issues of race and sexism and so on and so forth. So you don't want to just say, well, we're just going to go back to that old politics, because that old politics had all kinds of problems. But one of the reasons that a lot of workers feel abandoned was that there was a shift and there was a sense in which their concerns were not validated anymore. But then the question is, but I'm going to stop there because I know there's so many here who might want to ask that question. So, how do you wrestle with that politics, the cultural versus the material kind of divides and axes? But